In 2021, geneticists sequencing an ancient skeleton from southern Japan found something that shouldn't have been there. DNA that didn't match any population on Earth, living or dead. Not Japanese, not Korean, not Chinese. A ghost lineage that helped build the genetic foundation of over 120 million people, then disappeared. This is not science fiction. It is one of the strangest and most well-documented stories in modern human genetics, and it comes from real peer-reviewed research published in some of the most respected scientific journals in the world. To understand how a ghost population ended up inside the DNA of an entire nation, we have to go back much further than most people expect. Tens of thousands of years before Japan was even Japan, back to a time when the islands we know today were not islands at all. Around 38,000 years ago, a group of Upper Paleolithic humans crossed into what is now the Japanese archipelago. At the time, the land bridges connecting the region to the Asian mainland were still passable, and small bands of hunter-gatherers moved across them in search of new territory. These early settlers would eventually become the ancestors of a culture known as the Jomon, named after the cord-marked pottery they left behind, some of the oldest pottery ever discovered anywhere on the planet. For thousands of years, the Jomon thrived as hunter-gatherers and fishers, developing an intricate relationship with the forests, rivers, and coastlines of the archipelago. But then something happened that would permanently alter the genetic destiny of everyone who came after them. As the last ice age ended, global temperatures rose and glaciers began to melt at a staggering rate. Sea levels climbed higher and higher, slowly swallowing the land bridges that once connected Japan to the rest of the Asian continent. Somewhere between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, the process was complete. Japan became an island nation, cut off from the mainland by open water. The Jomon people, who had once been part of a much larger continental population, were now isolated, trapped on an archipelago with no way back, and, for thousands of years, very little contact with the outside world. This isolation is not just a poetic detail, it is written directly into the DNA of every Jomon skeleton scientists have ever sequenced. When researchers compare Jomon genomes to those of other ancient and modern populations across Asia, they find something remarkable. The Jomon lineage sits in what geneticists call a basal position relative to other East Eurasian populations. In plain language, that means the Jomon split off from the rest of the East Asian genetic family tree earlier than almost anyone else, and then stayed apart, evolving along their own separate path for millennia, while isolated on their island home. Their effective population size stayed astonishingly small, hovering around just 1,000 individuals for generation after generation, an isolated genetic pocket quietly persisting, while massive population movements reshaped the rest of the continent. Living in near total isolation for so many thousands of years did not mean the Jomon people were simple or unchanging. Archaeological evidence paints a picture of a surprisingly sophisticated culture, one that built elaborate pit dwellings, developed intricate pottery traditions, decorated with distinctive cord markings, and in some regions, constructed monumental stone circles and ritual sites, whose purpose scientists are still working to fully understand. The Jomon were not farmers in the traditional sense, yet they managed diverse food sources with remarkable skill, harvesting shellfish along the coastlines, hunting deer and wild boar through dense forests, and gathering chestnuts, acorns, and other wild plants with enough consistency to support settled or semi-settled village life for extended periods, something quite unusual among hunter-gatherer societies elsewhere in the ancient world. Their genetic isolation, in other words, did not translate into cultural stagnation. It produced one of the longest continuously identifiable prehistoric cultures anywhere on the planet, spanning well over 10,000 years before it began to give way to new arrivals and new ways of life. For a very long time, this is where the story seemed to end. A small, isolated founding population cut off by rising seas, slowly becoming the ancestors of the people who would later call this archipelago home. But isolation, as history so often shows, does not last forever. Roughly 2,800 years ago, something began to change on the shores of Japan. New arrivals appeared, bringing with them a technology that would transform the islands forever: wet rice cultivation. This period is known to archaeologists as the Yayoi period, and it marks one of the most significant demographic and cultural shifts in the entire history of the Japanese archipelago. Rice cultivation changed everything about how people on the archipelago lived. Where the Jomon had relied on hunting, fishing, and gathering, the Yayoi brought paddy field agriculture, along with new tools, new pottery styles, bronze and iron metalworking, and entirely new patterns of settlement built around fixed agricultural fields rather than seasonal foraging routes. Population density increased. Villages grew larger and more permanent. Social structures became more hierarchical, laying early groundwork for the more complex political systems that would eventually emerge centuries later. This was not a subtle shift happening quietly at the margins of society. It was a fundamental transformation of how people on the islands fed themselves, organized their communities, and related to the land itself, and it happened in tandem with a significant infusion of new ancestry into the existing island population. The traditional explanation taught in textbooks for decades is what scientists call the dual structure model. According to this model, the Yayoi migrants arrived from the Asian continent, most likely from the Korean Peninsula region, and gradually mixed with the indigenous Jomon population who were already living across the islands. Over time, this mixing produced the genetic profile seen in mainland Japanese populations today, a blend of ancient island isolation and newer continental ancestry. For years, this simple two-part story was considered settled science. Jomon plus continental migrant equals modern Japanese. Clean, tidy, and relatively straightforward. But science has a habit of complicating tidy stories, and that is exactly what happened when researchers began sequencing the actual genomes of Yayoi period skeletons, rather than relying solely on skull shapes and archaeological inference. When scientists analyzed ancient DNA extracted from two individuals associated with the Yayoi culture from the southwestern part of the archipelago, they expected to confirm the dual structure model in fine genetic detail. Instead, they found something that did not fit cleanly into either category. Statistical testing rejected the idea that the Yayoi were simply unmixed descendants of the Jomon, confirming that continental ancestry really had entered the population. That much lined up with expectations. But when researchers tried to pinpoint exactly which continental population had contributed that ancestry, the results became far stranger than anyone anticipated. Using a genetic testing method that compares ancient populations against one another to measure shared ancestry, researchers systematically checked whether any known ancient East Asian population showed a stronger genetic connection to the Yayoi than the Jomon did. They tested populations from across the continent, including groups associated with the Yellow River Basin in China, a region widely considered one of the possible origin points for rice farming traditions that eventually spread outward across East Asia. If the story were simple, one of these known populations should have matched, but the results told a different story. Most of the sampled ancient continental populations showed no significant genetic affinity to the Yayoi individuals at all. The new ancestral component woven into Yayoi genomes did not clearly trace back to any of the ancient populations available for comparison. In genetics, when a contributing ancestral population shows up clearly in the mathematics of a genome, but cannot be matched to any known sampled population, scientists sometimes refer to it informally as a ghost population. It is a lineage whose genetic fingerprint is undeniably present, shaping the DNA of real, sequenced individuals, while the population itself remains unsampled, unidentified, and, in some sense, genetically invisible. This is precisely what researchers encountered when they dug into the ancestry of the Yayoi. Admixture analysis revealed an entirely new ancestral component appearing for the first time in the Yayoi genetic profile, one that closely resembled ancestry patterns seen in populations from the Amur River Basin and the surrounding regions of Northeast Asia, alongside a second, broader East Asian genetic signal. The precise, specific population source of this ancestry, however, remained elusive, a ghost in the genetic machine, present in its effects but absent from the historical record. Scientists could directly sample. Whoever these people were, they left behind no clearly identified skeletal remains that have yet been sequenced and matched with confidence. Their direct genetic signature does not perfectly align with any single population scientists have analyzed so far. And yet, their DNA is unmistakably present, quietly folded into the genomes of Yayoi period farmers, and by extension, folded into the ancestry of tens of millions of people living in Japan today. It is one thing to know history left gaps. It is another thing entirely to find those gaps written directly into your own genetic code, still detectable more than 2,000 years later. If the story stopped there, it would already be remarkable. Two ancestral populations, one deeply isolated for tens of thousands of years, one a partially mysterious continental group linked to the arrival of rice farming, blending together to form the genetic backbone of a nation. But research over the past several years has revealed that the story does not stop there at all. There is a third chapter, and it may be the most unexpected one of all. For decades, scientists assumed that once the Jomon and the Yayoi-related migrants had mixed, the genetic story of mainland Japan was essentially complete, evolving quietly forward from that blended population without any major additional disruptions. But when researchers expanded their ancient genome sampling to include individuals from the Kofun period, the era associated with the rise of powerful clan states, massive burial mounds, and the eventual formation of a unified Japanese imperial system, they discovered something nobody had predicted. A new wave of ancestry appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, layered on top of the Jomon and Yayoi blend that had existed for centuries. The Kofun period itself takes its name from the massive keyhole-shaped burial mounds constructed for powerful rulers and clan leaders during this era, some of them among the largest tomb structures ever built anywhere in the ancient world. rivaling in scale some of the more famous monumental construction projects that people typically associate with ancient Egypt or China. This was a time of consolidating political power, expanding trade and diplomatic contact across the Korean peninsula and mainland China, and gradually forming the institutional foundations that would eventually become the imperial court system of Japan. It makes a certain intuitive sense that such an era of intense cross-continental contact might also be a period of renewed genetic exchange. What surprised researchers was not that additional ancestry arrived during this time, but how significant and how previously undetected that additional genetic contribution turned out to be once high-quality ancient genomes from the period were finally available for analysis. This Kofun period genetic signal traces back to broader East Asian ancestry, and its arrival appears to coincide with a period of major cultural transformation, one associated with new forms of political organization, new burial customs, and increased connections across the East Asian mainland. Researchers who identified this pattern described it as genuinely unexpected, a later influx of ancestry that had not been anticipated based on the archaeological record alone. It forced a fundamental rewrite of how scientists understood Japanese population history. Instead of two ancestral pillars, Jomon and Yayoi, researchers now recognize three: the deeply isolated Jomon hunter-gatherers, the partially mysterious Yayoi-era migrants linked to the introduction of rice farming, and this later Kofun period wave of continental ancestry that arrived during the formation of the Japanese state itself. Scientists now call this the tripartite model of Japanese genomic origins, and it represents one of the more significant revisions to East Asian population history in recent memory. All three of these ancestral threads continue to shape the genomes of people living in Japan today, though not in equal measure everywhere. Genetic studies of modern populations across the archipelago have revealed striking regional variation in exactly how much of each ancestral component any given person carries. Populations in certain regions, particularly the Ainu people of Hokkaido in the north and the Ryukyuan people of Okinawa in the south, tend to carry noticeably higher proportions of Jomon-related ancestry than populations in the central mainland, despite the geographic distance separating these two groups from one another. This pattern strongly suggests that continental migration during the Yayoi and Kofun periods did not spread evenly across the islands. Instead, it appears to have concentrated more heavily in certain regions, diluting Jomon ancestry unevenly and leaving pockets on the northern and southern edges of the archipelago, where older, deeper island lineages remained comparatively more intact. Consider what that actually means for a moment. Two populations, the Ainu in the far north and the Ryukyuans in the far south, separated by well over 2,000 kilometers of mainland territory, show a closer genetic relationship to each other than either group shows to the mainland Japanese populations sitting geographically between them. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a minor statistical footnote either. It is a direct genetic signature of history itself, a fossilized record of how continental migration during the Yayoi and Kofun periods likely swept most heavily through the central mainland corridor while leaving the more peripheral edges of the archipelago comparatively less affected. The geography of ancient migration, in other words, is still legible today, encoded quietly inside modern genomes, waiting for researchers with the right tools to read it. This regional patchwork means that, genetically speaking, there is no single uniform Japanese ancestry. There are gradients, layers, echoes of different migrations, stacked unevenly on top of one another, depending on where in the archipelago your ancestors happen to live over the past several thousand years. Recent research using extremely high coverage, ancient genomes, some sequenced at more than 60 times depth, an extraordinary level of genetic detail that allows scientists to distinguish subtle variation with far greater confidence than earlier lower resolution studies ever could, has only reinforced how complex and regionally varied this ancestral tapestry truly is. These newer studies have also begun uncovering additional details beyond simple ancestry proportions, including genetic variants linked to starch digestion, hints at how ancient dietary shifts from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle toward one increasingly built around cultivated grains may have left measurable fingerprints on the human genome itself. Now, with all of this in mind, it becomes much easier to understand where a claim like Japanese people carrying DNA from a species that isn't fully human likely comes from, and why it represents a serious distortion of the real science rather than an accurate summary of it. The true story already contains a hidden, unidentified ancestral population whose genetic signature does not perfectly match anything scientists have directly sampled. It already contains a completely unexpected wave of ancestry that surprised even the researchers who discovered it. It already contains real regional variation, deep isolation lasting tens of thousands of years, and genetic lineages so old and so distinct that they forced scientists to rewrite established models more than once. In other words, the real story is already strange enough, dramatic enough, and scientifically significant enough without needing to invent anything false about non-human ancestry. But there is one more layer to this story, and it happens to be the part that is closest to true, even though it still does not involve anything other than fully human beings. Every single person alive today whose ancestry traces outside of Africa, and that includes the overwhelming majority of people living in Japan, carries a small but very real percentage of DNA inherited from Neanderthals. This is not myth, folklore, or misinterpretation. It is one of the most well-established findings in all of modern genetics, confirmed through the sequencing of Neanderthal remains and repeated comparison against thousands of modern human genomes from populations all across the globe. To put that timeline into perspective, this Neanderthal interbreeding happened long before the Jomon ever set foot on the Japanese archipelago, long before rice farming existed anywhere in the world, and long before anything resembling the modern concept of separate nations, ethnicities, or cultures had even begun to take shape. It is a shared inheritance, sitting far beneath every later chapter of human migration and settlement, a common thread running through the DNA of Jomon hunter-gatherers, Yayoi rice farmers, Kofun period elites, and the modern population of Japan today, because it predates the split between any of these later, more localized population histories entirely. Roughly 50,000 years ago, give or take, as anatomically modern humans expanded out of Africa and into Europe and Asia, they encountered Neanderthal populations who had already been living across those regions for hundreds of thousands of years. These two related but distinct human lineages did not simply pass each other by. They interbred, repeatedly in multiple locations, over an extended period of time. The genetic evidence of that interbreeding survives today, embedded directly into the DNA of people whose ancestors left Africa, at levels generally estimated between 1 and 2% across most non-African populations, including East Asian populations, such as those found throughout the Japanese archipelago. Some research even suggests certain East Asian populations may carry a slightly higher percentage of Neanderthal, derived genetic material than European populations, along with smaller, more variable traces of ancestry connected to Denisovans, a separate and even more mysterious ancient human lineage first identified through a single fragment of bone in a Siberian cave. The Denisovan story is particularly striking because so little of it comes from actual skeletal remains. For years, everything scientists knew about Denisovans came from a handful of fragments, a finger bone, a few teeth, a piece of jawbone, recovered from a single cave in Siberia, and later from a site on the Tibetan plateau. Despite this astonishingly sparse physical record, the genetic legacy of Denisovans is anything but sparse. Populations across parts of Asia, and most dramatically, across Melanesia and parts of the Pacific, carry meaningfully higher percentages of Denisovan-derived DNA than almost anywhere else on Earth. A striking reminder of how much population history can be reconstructed purely from genetic patterns, even in the near total absence of physical remains to examine directly. East Asian populations, including those in Japan, generally carry smaller and more variable traces of this ancestry compared to populations further south and east across the Pacific. But the underlying pattern points to the same broader truth. Multiple distinct human lineages coexisted, encountered one another, and interbred at various points across tens of thousands of years of shared human history, leaving overlapping genetic fingerprints scattered unevenly across populations around the entire globe. Neanderthals and Denisovans were not some other, lesser category of being, and they certainly were not a different species in the dramatic, alien sense that sensational headlines often imply. They were closely related human lineages, cousins on the family tree of Homo sapiens, distinct enough to be genetically identifiable, yet close enough to interbreed successfully and leave viable, fertile offspring behind, offspring whose descendants are alive and walking around the planet right now, carrying pieces of the ancient interbreeding quietly stored inside nearly every cell of their bodies. Interbreeding between related human lineages does not make anyone less human. It makes the human story richer, messier, and far more interconnected than a simple, single-origin narrative would ever suggest. A reminder that the boundaries humans like to draw around identity and ancestry rarely map neatly onto the far messier, far more entangled reality preserved inside our actual genomes. So when you strip away the sensationalized framing, what remains is something genuinely remarkable, backed by real published research from real scientific institutions rather than manufactured mystery. Japanese ancestry is not the product of contact with some non-human species hidden away in secretive laboratory findings. It is the product of one of the most detailed, well-documented, and continuously evolving population genetic stories on Earth. A small band of Upper Paleolithic humans crossed into an isolated archipelago nearly 40,000 years ago. Rising seas sealed them off from the rest of humanity for tens of thousands of years, allowing a genetically distinct island population to quietly take shape. Then, roughly 2,800 years ago, a wave of rice farming migrants arrived, bringing with them ancestry so genetically unusual that scientists still cannot pin its precise point of origin with full confidence, even after years of dedicated research. Centuries later, during the rise of Imperial Japan, an entirely unexpected third wave of ancestry appeared, reshaping the genetic landscape once again in ways nobody had predicted from the archaeological record alone. And underlying every single one of these chapters, quietly present in the background the entire time, sits a small but very real inheritance from Neanderthals, a genuine, scientifically confirmed connection to a related but distinct branch of the ancient human family tree. This is the real story hidden inside ancient Japanese DNA, and it did not need any exaggeration to become fascinating. It needed careful, patient, rigorous science, the kind that takes years to unfold, the kind that keeps surprising even the researchers doing the work. Every time scientists think they have finally mapped out the full genetic history of the Japanese archipelago, a new genome, a new statistical technique, or a newly sequenced ancient skeleton reveals another layer nobody had anticipated. The ghost population hidden inside Yayoi ancestry may still be waiting out there somewhere, preserved in bones not yet discovered or not yet sequenced, holding clues about a chapter of East Asian history that remains, for now, only partially understood. Every new excavation, every improvement in laboratory technique, and every fresh comparison against newly sequenced ancient genomes from across the wider Asian continent brings researchers one step closer to finally naming the population responsible for that mysterious signal, closing a gap in the historical record that has quietly persisted for more than 2,000 years. There is also something worth pausing on in how this research actually gets done, because the process itself is almost as remarkable as the findings. Extracting usable ancient DNA from human remains that are thousands of years old is an extraordinarily delicate task. Bone and tooth samples have to be handled in specialized clean rooms designed to prevent contamination from modern human DNA, which is present virtually everywhere, on skin, in dust, even floating in ordinary air. Researchers typically target the dense petrous bone at the base of the skull, a structure that tends to preserve genetic material far better than other parts of the skeleton, particularly in warm, humid climates like much of Japan, where organic material and DNA both degrade relatively quickly compared to colder environments. Even under ideal conditions, many ancient samples yield too little usable genetic material to sequence at all, which is part of why high-coverage ancient Japanese genomes, the kind detailed enough to support confident individual-level analysis, remained so rare for so long, and why each new one that is successfully recovered tends to reshape the surrounding scientific conversation so significantly. And that, in the end, is what makes real science so much more compelling than manufactured mystery. The unknown does not need embellishment to be captivating. Somewhere out there, an unidentified population once contributed a measurable, mathematically undeniable piece of ancestry to millions of living people, and researchers still do not know exactly who they were. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is not a myth. That is simply where the current edge of scientific knowledge sits, an open question waiting for the right piece of ancient bone, the right laboratory technique, and the right team of researchers to finally bring one more ghost out of the genetic shadows and into the light of confirmed history. Until that day comes, the honest answer is the most fascinating one available. The ancestry of the Japanese people is a layered, living record of isolation, migration, rediscovery, and connection, written not by any non-human species, but by the long, complicated, deeply human story of people finding their way across oceans, continents, and thousands of generations to become who they are today.